So I was 23 years old, working with a private equity firm, commuting every week from Boston to Los Angeles. That was a heck of a commute. Was coming back home to visit family in North Dakota for the holidays, and I look up and I realize on the plane I'm seated next to Louie Anderson, one of the greatest comedians of all time, one of my comedy heroes. I figured I got a pretty captive audience. He's not going anywhere. So I start chatting him up. And we ended up having a fantastic conversation. Talked the whole way back to Minneapolis. He invited me to one of his shows. He was looking for some help on a book he was working on at the time called The F Word, How to Survive Your Family. It's fantastic. Fast forward a few months. The book's ready to come out, and Louie's looking for a manager. And I knew I had about 18 months or so before I was going to go to business school. And I end up deciding to give up this fantastic job in the private equity world to go out on tour with a comedian. And I ended up learning more about leadership during those 18 months on the road with Louie Anderson than I have in all the years since then. I thought I'd share just a few of those lessons with you. So one of the things that really attracted me to this was I've always been amazed at what comedians do on stage. You think about what they're up against. Think about a Friday night crowd. You're coming to the theater. You got the weight of the week on your shoulders. You're thinking about what's going on at work, thinking about what's going on at home, thinking about anything other than what's going on in that theater. And for an hour, the great comedians make you forget about all that. And they'll take you on a journey going wherever they want you to go. I wanted to learn how to move an audience quite like that. So we go out on tour, and I ended up, one of the first things I realized was I met a number of comedians, and I realized that comedians are not who you think they are. I think we've got this perception that comedians are just the class clown that never really grew up. Well, the reality couldn't be further from the truth. They end up being some of the smartest people I've ever had the pleasure of working with. They're introverts. Ultimately, comedians are observers. They're the folks standing in the back of the room, observing what's going on, trying to figure out the interaction points of everybody in the audience, trying to figure out the interaction points of how to actually make a connection. And they have this really odd job because we grow up, and it's drilled into our heads that if you're going to do well in your career, you got to take it seriously. And they're trying to be funny. They're ultimately taking funny seriously. Well, I started to think about it, and I realized that in order for me to take something seriously, you got to see all sides of it on any given topic. And I don't know that I've seen all sides of an issue until I've found the humor in it. So to get serious, find the funny. So we go out on tour for about 18 months or so. It was fantastic. I saw Louie in every single environment you could possibly imagine. Everywhere from a converted bingo hall in New Mexico, complete with the bingo board on the stage behind him. A couple weeks later, he's playing a charity event in Washington, D.C. He's co-headlining with James Brown, the godfather of soul. Or as I called it, the hardest working man in show business with the laziest man in show business. A couple weeks after that, he's playing to a sold-out 4,000-seat theater in Minneapolis. You couldn't get 3 more different venues. And yet, the material was very similar. The audience reaction was almost exactly the same. He killed it across all of them. The amount of effort he put into each show was exactly the same. And the amount of time that he spent with fans after the show was also exactly the same. The paychecks were totally different. But I asked him afterwards, I said, Louie, how on earth do you do that? How do you get just as up to perform in front of 100 people in a bingo hall as you do in front of 4,000 people in a great theater or in front of a room full of celebrities? And what he said has always stuck with me. He said, Dave, what choice do I have? I can't control the venue. I can't control the size of the audience, but I got full control over how entertained they are once they get there. And I felt like what a fantastic lesson in leadership. Because as leaders, oftentimes we get so wrapped up in all the things outside of our control. It might be what's going on with our competitors, what's going on in the market, all outside of our control, when if we can just encourage our teams to do fantastic work on everything that's within our control, we'll succeed a lot more quickly. It also taught me a really solid lesson about the criticality of working hard as a leader. Again, he put in the exact same amount of effort in front of all of those audiences. It didn't matter how much he was being paid. He was there to entertain. And I took that and realized that there's a little element of stand-up comedy that a lot of people don't realize. If you go to Los Angeles or New York, go out to a comedy club late night on a Monday or Tuesday night, 11 o'clock, midnight. There's a really high likelihood you're going to see some of the biggest comedians in the world playing in front of really small audiences. They just do pop-ins. It might be Chris Rock, it might be Jerry Seinfeld, it might be Louis C.K. They all come because they recognize that it doesn't matter how successful you are as a comedian. You have to continue practicing. They all know that practice never makes perfect as a comedian. Practice never makes perfect as a leader, but practice always makes better. You know that little voice we all have inside our head where when we think of something, we think, this is hilarious. And then you verbalize it, realize you're totally wrong. The comedians have exactly the same voice, but they know it. And they know that they've got to perfect something in front of an audience. They've got to practice it over and over again in front of an audience to actually make it work. One of the least funny comedians I've ever seen was Chris Rock in front of 20 people on a Tuesday night. One of the funniest comedians I have ever seen was Chris Rock in front of about 2,000 people on a Saturday night. Over that time, he had figured out what it was about the material that was resonating, the cadence that was going to work in front of a larger audience. And ultimately, they know that one of my favorite definitions of leadership is trust plus vision equals leadership. Trust plus vision equals leadership. On stage, you are building that trust over the course of an hour. You don't have a lot of time to do it. You got a few seconds to grab an audience. And a lot of times comedians do it by making a very personal connection with everyone in that audience. They're showing that they've got a shared set of values, and once they know the audience realizes you've got a shared set of values, they're going to trust you, and they're going to go wherever you want them to go. That's an incredibly powerful leadership lesson. And every comedian does it in a little bit different way. They're not afraid to be vulnerable. That's why these really big names will perform in front of 20 people completely randomly on a Tuesday night, because they're not afraid to be vulnerable on stage if it's a part of the effort of honing the material. Every comedian does it a little bit differently. So one of the most memorable experiences I had was that very briefly I got to meet Rodney Dangerfield. And I think we all know Rodney is one of the great comedians of the 20th century. But it didn't start out that way. Early on in his career, Rodney had a small family, young kids. Comedy was not putting food on that table. So he gave it up. And for about 7 or 8 years, Rodney Dangerfield, his real name is Jack Roy, goes door to door selling aluminum siding for 7 or 8 years. And he recognizes in going door to door that everybody loves an underdog. He started seeing that in people one-on-one. Everybody loves an underdog. And so he started getting up the courage to go back up on stage. And eventually he started honing this persona of the guy who gets no respect. Started playing in front of bigger and bigger audiences. Eventually he gets on television and he starts getting back on the up on the Tonight Show. And he becomes known for these one-liners that were just rapid fire. And it was material like, oh, my parents, they moved all the time when I was growing up. I always found them. Right? Oh, I'll tell you, I was an ugly baby. In fact, I'll tell you, I was so ugly. When I was born, the doctor slapped the wrong end. And he'd hit the crowd with this one after the other. Right? They were classic. He'd do dozens of these one-liners over the course of a 6-minute set on The Tonight Show. They all pointed back to this single element around not getting any respect, the guy who gets no respect. Over the next 30 or 40 years, he hones this persona, and he becomes a big-name comedian that we all remember today. What a lot of people don't recognize or didn't know is that during that 30 or 40-year career, he also mentored every single big-name comedian in Hollywood, every single one. And that's a big part of the reason why today, over a decade after his passing, Rodney Dangerfield, the guy who built a career getting no respect, continues to be one of the most well-respected comedians among comedians in Hollywood. So I go to business school. I end up very fortunate to get into a fantastic business school there at Dartmouth College. and was a strategy consultant for a couple years after business school, and I've been a software executive for the last decade or so. But I recognized I stayed in touch with Louie, and we became very good friends. I've been very blessed to have him in my life for the last 17, 18 years or so. And I'd always give him one-liners. When you're friends with a comedian, you're always going to give them a line just to see if they'll use it. So he did, and they worked. And so eventually he said, Dave, if you ever want to open for me in Las Vegas, you're more than welcome to. It took me about a split second to accept that offer. And about a week to walk myself off the ledge of being completely daunted by what I had just signed up for. Because in that split second, I had forgotten that I wasn't that good. That's a critical piece of information right there. I had chaos going on at work. I was right in that point in my career where I was kind of pretty rapidly accelerating, and so I was working 1,000,000 hours. I mentioned I got 3 kids at home, 3 kids under 7. It was complete chaos at home between my wife and the kids, but I accepted this, and I accepted it as a challenge. I said, you know what, over the next 6 months, I'm going to do this. Actors have Hollywood and Broadway, comedians have Vegas. This is the pinnacle for what a lot of comedians can get to, and I've just found a fast lane. So I went out and did an open mic at least once, sometimes twice a week, every single week for 6 months. It was awful. It was terrible, right? I'd record every single one of them, and I'd listen to it at the end of the night. And after the first few, the recordings were crystal clear. There were no interruptions for laughter whatsoever. None. I started realizing I was completely different from everyone else that was going up on that stage. Everyone else was kind of in their early 20s. They're doing material about dating or partying. I was putting my kids to bed and then going to a bar so I could get stage time and talk about how hard it is to put a diaper on a 2-year-old in 8 seconds or less, what I call the diaper rodeo. But material did not resonate at all. I also started seeing that once you get to a certain point in your life, and once you get to a certain point in your career, you stop failing. And I started noticing that once I was failing on stage, and I do it week after week, I'd keep at it and keep at it, it actually was paying dividends. It made me a lot more vulnerable. And I didn't mind kind of putting myself out there that way on stage. It made me a much better leader at work, a much better manager, I think a more empathetic manager. It definitely made me a better father and better husband. I became a much better listener. So it was paying all these dividends outside of the stage. Think to yourself, when was the last time that you actively failed at something? I'm guessing it's probably been a while. Well, but when you're growing up, you're failing all the time. It's no big deal. Every time you try something new, of course you're going to fail at it. But we start to get good at something and we hone in on this path and you get better and better and better, and all of a sudden you wake up, it's 20 years later and you haven't actively failed in a long time. When you stop failing, you stop learning. If there's one message I'd like for you to take away from our time today, it's that when you stop failing, you stop learning. Go out and actively fail. It doesn't have to be stand-up comedy. It could be music. It could be a new sport. It could be mentalism. Honestly, doesn't matter what it is. But that act of failing pays so many more dividends in other parts of your life. So I end up getting to Las Vegas, played 3 nights at the Excalibur right on the Strip in Las Vegas, and it was fantastic. We created memories that lasted a lifetime. It was a true bucket list item. But the memories that have lasted, the ones that have really made an impact, was all the failure that led up to it. If there's one thing I knew in comedy, it was Louie's audience. Right? Louie Anderson's audience, I've been to over 200 of his shows, met literally thousands of his fans. They are looking for family-friendly material. Most of them are parents themselves. My material ended up resonating with them, and I was absolutely thrilled. But those acts of failure leading up to it have continued resonating. So I'll leave you with one final lesson from stand-up comedians. And I'd like you to think about your favorite manager. Who was your favorite manager? How did they become your favorite manager? How did they make that connection with you? I'm guessing it was probably a very personal connection. It was one-on-one. Probably were pretty vulnerable. It was clear over time you shared some values with them. Once they had made that connection, all of a sudden, they'd set out a vision. For you to follow it would be easy. Might be weeks, months, years later. I'm guessing you probably don't remember any of the any of the disagreements you had, any of the projects you worked on, but I guarantee you remember how they made you feel. Those were the values that sustained when they left the room. This is one of my favorite elements of leadership. True leadership are the values that sustain when you leave the room. Now think about your favorite comedian. Going to see one of their shows, you're walking out of the theater after the show, your probably sides hurt from laughing so hard. I'm guessing you probably don't remember a single joke they told. It happens to all of us. But I guarantee you remember how they made you feel. So as you think about building up your leadership toolkit, I'm encouraging you to leave room for 2 extra tools. Number 1, I sincerely hope you'll be thoughtful about finding some room for humor in that toolkit, because I think it can be really powerful. And I think if it's used thoughtfully, it can pay dividends. And number 2, I really hope that you will be conscious and thoughtful about the values that you hope to sustain when you leave that stage. Thank you.